The shuttle door opened, and 12-year-old Elias Wren stepped out into the largest space station he had ever seen in his entire life. And for a moment, he just stood there, with his mouth hanging open like a fish pulled out of water. Veyrath Prime was enormous beyond anything he had imagined, and the ceiling stretched so high above him that clouds actually formed up there, real, actual clouds inside a building. And the walls were covered in glowing symbols from 100 different alien languages, and none of them were English, and none of them were any human language at all. He was the only human here, and he was the youngest student the Galactic Academy of Xenolinguistics had ever admitted. And he was also the smallest person on the entire station by a very large margin. The Torvon who ran the academy were 12 feet tall, with 4 arms each, and skin like polished granite, and they moved through the corridors like walking mountains, and every single one of them looked down at Elias the way a person might look down at a bug on the sidewalk. His human escort, a tall woman from the Earth Diplomatic Corps, knelt down in front of him and put her hands on his shoulders and said, "You are going to do amazing things here, Elias." And then she walked back into the shuttle, and the door closed, and he was alone. Completely alone. He picked up his single bag, which contained 3 changes of clothes, and a tablet loaded with every book on linguistics his mother had ever recommended, and a small wooden cat his little sister had carved for him before he left, and he walked into the academy. The registration hall was full of alien students from dozens of species, and every single one of them was bigger than him, and every single one of them stared at him as he walked past. A group of Torvon juveniles, who were already 7 feet tall, even though they were only a few years older than Elias, stopped their conversation and watched him with their 6 orange eyes, and one of them, a broad-shouldered young male named Kethis, leaned over to his friend and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Is that the human they told us about?" And his friend replied, "It must be." And Kethis laughed and said, "I thought they would at least send a grown one." The whole group laughed, and the sound was deep and rumbling like rocks falling down a hill. And Elias kept his eyes forward, and kept walking, and pretended he did not hear them, even though his face turned red and his throat felt tight. He was assigned to Study Group 9, which was the lowest-ranked group in the academy, and his dormitory room was so small that it had clearly been a storage closet before they converted it, and the bed was too big for him because it had been built for species that were twice his size. His mentor was a senior Torvon scholar named Drethon, who had 4 golden rings on each of his 4 arms, which meant he was very important and very respected. His office, for the first time, Drethon looked at him for a long time, without saying anything. Then Drethon turned to his colleague, who was standing nearby, and said, "The Concord insisted we accept a human applicant as part of the new membership terms." And he said it as though Elias was not even in the room. And his colleague nodded and said, "A political concession, then?" And Drethon said, "Precisely that, and nothing more." Elias stood there and listened to them talk about him, like he was a piece of furniture, and he said nothing, because what could he say, and who would listen, even if he did say something? That first week was the hardest week of his entire life, and every class was taught in Galactic Standard, which he could speak, but not as fast as the others, and every assignment assumed a baseline knowledge of xenolinguistic theory that most alien children absorbed naturally through their species telepathy, or bioresonance, or sonic memory, but which Elias had to learn from scratch. Scratch by reading textbooks late into the night. The other students did not bully him exactly, because that would require them to think of him as an equal worth bullying, and instead they simply ignored him, as though he was not there at all, as though his desk was empty, as though his voice made no sound. But Elias had not come to Veyrath Prime to make friends. He had come because of the Vrashkai. The Vrashkai were the reason the Academy existed this cycle, and they were the greatest unsolved puzzle in galactic xenolinguistics. Everyone knew it, and everyone wanted to be the one to crack it. The Vrashkai were massive feline creatures that lived on a death world called Kalem 7. They were 600 pounds of muscle and claw and teeth and fury. They had 6 eyes that glowed like hot coals, and fur that shifted color with their mood, and they were absolutely terrifying. The galaxy classified them as non-sentient apex predators, and that meant they had no rights and no protections, and their planet could be used however the Galactic Concord wanted to use it. And right now, powerful Torvon corporations wanted to tear Kalem 7 apart for its rare minerals. But for 400 years, some linguists had wondered if the Vrashkai might actually be intelligent, because their vocalizations were unusually complex for simple animals. And nobody had ever been able to prove it one way or the other, because nobody had ever been able to decode a single sound they made. Every team that tried had failed, and every algorithm that was built had found nothing, and every scholar who dedicated their career to the Vrashkai had eventually given up and moved on to easier problems. Elias had read every single paper ever published about the Vrashkai, and he had listened to every recording that was publicly available, and he had been doing this since he was 8 years old, when his mother, who was a deaf linguist, had shown him a spectrogram of a Vrashkai. Roar and said, "What do you see in that pattern, Elias?" And he had looked at it and said, "It looks like music." On his 3rd night at the academy, Elias went to the archives alone, and he requested access to the full Vrashkai audio database, which contained 400 years of raw recordings. And the archive system granted his request, because nobody had accessed those files in over 20 years, and nobody cared enough to restrict them. He sat in the dark archive room with his headphones on, and he played a Vrashkai roar at normal speed, and it sounded like what everyone said it sounded like, which was a terrifying animal scream. Then he slowed it down to half speed, and it sounded strange and layered. Then he slowed it down to 1/8 speed, and his hands began to shake. Because at 1/8 speed, the roar was not a roar at all, and it was not a scream, and it was not the sound of a mindless beast. It was structured, and it was layered, and it was intentional. It had rhythm and pattern, and something that sounded so much like grammar that Elias felt tears forming in his eyes. He pulled off his headphones and whispered to himself in the dark, empty room, "That is not a roar." And his voice was shaking, and his heart was pounding, and he said, "That is a sentence." And somewhere very far away, on a world of red dust and black forests, a massive feline creature lifted her ancient head toward the stars and opened her mouth and spoke words that no one in the galaxy had ever understood. 3 weeks into the semester, Elias had dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes were wrinkled, and he had forgotten to eat breakfast 4 days in a row. But none of that mattered, because he had found something incredible, and he was absolutely certain of it. Every night after classes ended, he went to the archives, and he sat alone in the dark with his headphones, and he listened to Vrashkai recordings for hours and hours, and he slowed them down and sped them up, and layered them, and separated them, and ran them through every audio filter he could find, and he took notes in a small notebook that was already almost full. He had discovered something that no one else had ever noticed, and the reason no one had noticed it was because no other species in the galaxy heard sound the way humans did. The Torvon had excellent hearing, but they processed sound in single channels, which meant they heard one layer at a time, and the Shelvari had perfect pitch, but they focused on frequency, not on pattern, and the Dremni heard through vibration and water, and could not process airborne harmonics at all. But humans were different, because humans had evolved on Earth, which was a loud, chaotic, dangerous world full of rustling predators and crashing waves and birdsong and thunder and screaming wind. And over millions of years, the human brain had developed an auditory cortex that could separate and track multiple overlapping sound patterns simultaneously. This was why humans loved music, and why human music was layered with melody and harmony and rhythm and bass, all happening at the same time. and why a human could sit in a noisy room and still follow a single conversation, and why a mother could hear her own baby crying in a crowd of 1,000 voices. And this was the key to the Vrashkai language, because the Vrashkai did not speak in single sounds like every other known species, and instead they spoke in chords, and every single vocalization contained multiple frequencies layered on top of each other, and each layer carried different meaning, and the full meaning only emerged when you heard all the layers together as one unified structure. It was like music, and it was like nothing the galaxy had ever encountered. Elias was sure of this, and he was so excited that he made a terrible mistake, which was that he decided to share his findings with his study group. He stood in front of Study Group 9 on a Tuesday morning, and he explained his hypothesis, and he played audio examples, and he showed spectrograms, and he talked about human auditory evolution, and musical cognition, and emotional prosody, and he spoke clearly and carefully, and he thought he was making a very strong case. When he finished, there was silence. Then Kethis, who was sitting in the back row with his 4 arms crossed over his massive chest, started laughing. And it was not a kind laugh, and it was not a small laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that was designed to make someone feel very, very small. "The little ape thinks beasts write poetry," Kethis said, and the whole room erupted. They laughed so hard that the walls shook, and some of them were wiping tears from their eyes, and one Dremmi student actually fell out of their water chair, and even the instructor, a mid-level Torvan researcher, looked away to hide an embarrassed smile, because the idea was just that ridiculous to them. Elias stood at the front of the room, with his tablet in his hands, and his face burning, and his throat closing up, and he wanted to disappear, and he wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out, and he wanted to go home. But he did not cry, and he did not run, and he stood there until the laughter died down, and then he picked up his things and walked out of the room in silence. The humiliation did not stop there, because word spread fast in the academy, and by dinner, everyone knew about the human boy who thought he could talk to animals. Students from other study groups pointed at him in the corridors, and whispered and giggled, and someone left a toy animal on his desk with a note that said, "Translate this." Then Scholar Drethan called him into his office, and Elias thought that maybe his mentor would listen, and maybe he would give him a chance. But instead, Drethan sat behind his enormous desk and looked down at Elias with all 6 of his orange eyes, and said, "I have reviewed your hypothesis, and it is anthropocentric projection at its worst, and you are seeing patterns that do not exist because you want them to exist, and I am formally denying your request for computational resources, and I strongly suggest you abandon this line of research before you embarrass yourself further and embarrass this academy." Elias walked out of that office and went straight to his tiny closet room, and sat on the edge of his too-big bed and stared at the wall, and for the first time since he arrived, he felt truly defeated. Opened his quantum link communicator and called home, and his mother appeared on the screen, and she could see immediately that something was wrong, because mothers always know. And she asked him what happened, and he told her everything. His mother listened, and her face was calm and serious, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she lifted her hands and signed to him in the sign language she had taught him as his very first language before he could even speak. And she signed, "Every language looks like noise to someone who has not learned to listen." And something clicked inside him, and the defeat turned into something else, and it turned into fire. That night, he did not go to the archives, because the archives required academy access, and he was worried Drethan might revoke his privileges. So instead, he went to the station recycling bay, where broken and discarded equipment was piled in heaps, waiting to be processed, and he dug through the piles for 6 hours, until he found everything he needed. He found a damaged signal processor from an old communication relay, and a cracked resonance analyzer from a decommissioned science lab, and a set of audio amplifiers that someone had thrown away because one channel was blown, and he carried all of it back to his room in 3 trips. Over the next 5 days, he built his own signal processing lab from scratch, and it was ugly and messy and held together with adhesive tape and stolen wiring, but it worked, and it was his, and nobody could take it away from him. Then he sat down and wrote his own algorithms from nothing, and he did not use the standard galactic xenolinguistic frameworks, because those frameworks were designed for single-channel communication, and they would never work on the Vrashkai. And instead, he built something entirely new. He based it on 3 things that only a human would think to combine, and the first was musical theory, specifically the way human composers layered meaning through harmony and counterpoint. And the second was phoneme mapping from human tonal languages like Mandarin and Yoruba, where pitch changed meaning. And the third was something no alien researcher had ever even considered, which was emotional prosody modeling. Emotional prosody was the way humans conveyed feeling through the tone and rhythm and texture of their voice. And it was the reason you could hear a person say, "I am fine," and know immediately that they were not fine at all. And it was a uniquely human area of study, because most alien species communicated emotion through telepathy or color change or pheromones and not through sound. Elias believed that the Vrashkai did not just communicate information through their layered vocalizations, but that they communicated feeling states, and that these feeling states were not decoration or background noise, but were actually grammatical structures that carried core meaning. It was a wild theory, and it went against it everything the galactic academic establishment believed about how language worked. And if he was wrong, he would be the biggest joke the Academy had ever seen. But he was not wrong. Night after night he ran his algorithms, and night after night the patterns grew clearer, and the data started to organize itself into structures that looked more and more like grammar. And he filled notebook after notebook with his findings. Then one night, at 3 a.m. station time, he isolated a 3-harmonic cluster that appeared in every single Vrashkai recording that had been made during a specific lunar cycle on Kalem 7. And it appeared in recordings from different years and different locations and different individual Vrashkai, and it was always the same cluster, with the same structure and the same emotional signature. He ran it through his prosody model, and the translation came back, and he stared at it, and his hands started shaking so badly that he almost dropped his tablet. The 3-harmonic cluster translated roughly to a concept that no mindless beast should ever possess. It translated to remember. The Vrashkai had a word for memory, and they used it together at the same time during the same season every year, which meant they were not just remembering, but they were remembering together as a group in a coordinated ritual. Animals did not do that. Only people did that. Elias sat alone in his tiny closet room, surrounded by his junkyard equipment and his messy notebooks, and he held his tablet against his chest, and he cried, because he knew he was right, and he knew that nobody would believe him, and he knew that he could not stop. 6 weeks into the semester, the Academy was buzzing with frustration, because every single study group working on the Vrashkai problem had hit a wall, and not one of them had made any real progress, and the senior scholars were starting to argue with each other about methodology and funding, and who was to blame for the lack of results. Meanwhile, Elias was making more progress than anyone knew, and he was doing it alone in a converted storage closet with equipment held together by tape. But he was also exhausted, and he was making mistakes, and he was falling behind in his regular coursework, because he spent every spare minute on his secret research, and his grades were dropping, and Scholar Drethon had sent him 2 formal warnings about his academic performance. It was during this low point that Elias found an unlikely ally. Her name was Savory, and she was a Shelvari student, which meant she was a being made of living crystal, about 5 feet tall, with a body that chimed softly when she moved, and she had the most perfect pitch of any species in the galaxy, and she could hear frequencies that no other being could detect. Savri had noticed Elias working late in the recycling bay weeks ago, when she had gone there looking for spare parts for her own project, and she had watched him from a distance, and she had said nothing, because she did not know what to make of him. But one night she found him asleep at his desk in the common study area, with his headphones still on, and his tablet still playing Vrashkai audio on a loop. And she looked at the spectrogram on his screen, and she tilted her crystalline head, and she saw something in those patterns that made her stop and look more carefully. She did not believe his theory, but she respected his discipline, because Shelvari valued dedication above all other qualities, and this small human child was more dedicated than anyone she had ever met. She woke him up gently and said, "You will destroy yourself working like this." And Elias blinked at her and said, "I am close to something." And she said, "Close to what?" And he told her. He told her everything, because he was so tired and so lonely that the words just poured out of him, and he explained the layered harmonics and the emotional prosody and the grammatical feeling states and the word for remember. And when he was done, Savory was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "I do not believe this is possible, but I believe you believe it, and that is enough for now." And she reached into her bag and pulled out a small crystalline device that hummed within her light, and she said, "This is my personal resonance amplifier, and it can separate audio frequencies with a precision that your junkyard equipment cannot match, and I am lending it to you." Elias stared at her, and he did not know what to say, and she said, "Do not make me regret this, human." The resonance amplifier changed everything, because suddenly Elias could separate the Vrashkai harmonic layers with perfect clarity, and patterns that had been fuzzy and uncertain became sharp and defined, and his algorithms started producing results 10 times faster than before. Within 2 weeks, he had mapped something that made him want to scream with excitement. He had found the Vrashkai grammatical structure, and it was unlike anything that had ever been documented in the entire history of galactic xenolinguistics. The Vrashkai language had no nouns, and it had no verbs, and it had nothing that looked like any grammatical category that any known species used. And this was why every previous attempt to decode it had failed, because every previous researcher had been looking for something familiar, and the Vrashkai language was not familiar at all. Instead of nouns and verbs, the Vrashkai language was built entirely on relational emotional states between the speaker and the subject. And these emotional states were not simple feelings like happy or angry, but were incredibly complex and specific and layered. A Vrashkai did not say the prey runs the way a human or a Torvan would say it, and instead a Vrashkai said something that translated roughly to hunger that respects towards swift fear that deserves. And packed into that single vocalization was not just information about what was happening, but an entire emotional and moral framework about the relationship between predator and prey. It was a language that could not exist without empathy, because every single sentence required the speaker to model the emotional state of the subject. And it was a language that could not exist without moral reasoning, because every single sentence contained an implicit judgment about the relationship between beings. It was the most complex emotional grammar that had ever been encountered anywhere in the known galaxy, and it belonged to a species that the galaxy had classified as mindless beasts. Excitement, and he wanted to tell everyone, but he remembered what had happened last time, and so instead he went to Scholar Drethan privately, because despite everything, Drethan was still his mentor, and Drethan had the authority to bring this to a full academy. He entered Drethan's office and laid out his findings carefully and methodically, and he showed the grammatical structure and the emotional mapping and the relational framework, and he played audio examples with real-time translation overlays, and he was professional and calm and thorough. Drethan listened, and as Elias spoke, something changed in the old Torvan's face, and his 6 orange eyes widened, and his 4 hands gripped the edge of his desk, and for just a moment Elias saw something that looked like fear. Then Drethan's expression hardened, and he stood up to his full 12-foot height. And he said, "This research is being placed under immediate ethical review." And he reached across the desk and took Elias's tablet right out of his hands, and he said, "All data and materials related to this project are hereby confiscated pending review, and you are forbidden from continuing this line of research until further notice." Elias stood there in shock, and he said, "But the data proves they are sentient, and you can see it right there in the grammar." And Drethan said, "What I see is an unvetted hypothesis from an unqualified student, and this academy will not stake its reputation on the fantasies of a child." And his voice was cold and final. Elias left the office, feeling like he had been punched in the stomach, and he walked through the corridors in a daze, and he did not understand what had just happened, because the data was right there, and it was clear, and it was undeniable. So why would Drethan shut it down? Then he overheard something that made everything make terrible sense. Two Torvan administrators were talking in a side corridor, and they did not see Elias because he was small, and they were not looking down. And one of them said, "The mining consortium has increased their donation to the academy again." And the other said, "Of course they have, because the vote on Kalem 7 is in 3 weeks, and they need the academy to confirm that the Vrashkai are non-sentient." And suddenly, Elias understood everything. The mining vote was worth trillions of credits, and the Torvan corporations behind it had been funding the academy for years, and Scholar Drethan was connected to those corporations. And he had not shut down Elias's research because it was bad science, but because it was good science. And good science was dangerous when powerful people needed the answer to be something else. Elias felt sick, and he felt scared, and then he felt angry, and the anger was hot and bright, and it burned away the fear. That evening, Kethis the Torvan bully found Elias in a corridor, and blocked his path with his massive body, and leaned down and said, "I heard you had meeting with Drethan, and I heard it did not go well." And his voice was not mocking this time, but quiet and serious, and he said, "Drop it, little human, and you do not know what you are touching, and these are not people you want to make angry, Ellis." Elias looked up at Kethis, who was almost twice his height, and he said, "They are going to destroy an entire civilization for money." And Kethis said, "That is not your problem." And Elias said, "Then whose problem is it, Ellis?" Kethis had no answer for that, and he stepped aside and let Elias pass. That night, Elias went to Savory, and he told her what had happened, and she was furious, in the quiet, intense way that Shelvari expressed fury, which was a low, harmonic hum that made the walls vibrate. And she said, "You made copies, and it was not a question." Elias smiled for the first time in days, and said, "I hid a complete backup of everything in the memory core of your resonance amplifier before I went to Drethan's office." Him, with her crystalline eyes, and said, "You knew he would take it." And Elias said, "My mother taught me that people in power do not like being told they are wrong." That night, Elias sat in his room, and opened the backup data, and pulled up the live containment feeds from Kalem 7. And he watched the Vrashkai moving through their dark forests and red dust plains. And he watched them interact with each other, and hunt, and rest, and gather. Then a massive female Vrashkai, the largest one he had ever seen, walked directly toward the sensor drone that was recording the feed. And she stopped and looked straight into the camera with all 6 of her glowing eyes. And she opened her mouth and produced a vocalization that lasted 11 seconds. Elias ran it through his translation matrix in real time, and the words assembled on his screen, and he read them, and his blood went cold. She had said, "We know you are watching, and we have always known." And Elias realized that the Vrashkai were not just sentient, and they were not just intelligent, and they were not just aware. The Grand Symposium was the most important academic event in the galaxy, and it happened once every cycle at the Academy on Veyrath Prime, and it was broadcast live across the entire galactic concord to billions of beings on thousands of worlds, and the greatest minds in xenolinguistics gathered to present their research and debate their theories. And this cycle, every eye in the galaxy was watching, because the Vrashkai question had become the most controversial topic in Concord politics. The mining vote on Kalem 7 was 48 hours away, and the corporations were confident, and the politicians were ready, and everything was moving forward exactly as planned, and the only thing that could stop it was proof that the Vrashkai were sentient. Scholar Drethan had made sure that no such proof would come from the Academy, and Elias Wren had been formally barred from presenting at the symposium, and his access to Academy resources had been revoked, and his name had been removed from the records. The program, and as far as the official record was concerned, his research did not exist. But Elias was not alone anymore. In the 2 weeks since Drethan had confiscated his work, something remarkable had happened. Because Savory had started sharing fragments of his translations with students she trusted, and those students had shared them with others. And slowly, quietly, a small group had formed. There was Savory herself, whose resonance amplifier had made the breakthroughs possible. And there was a young Dremni named Pelith, who was a genius with data systems and could hack into almost anything. And there was a pair of twin Kessari students who were experts in acoustic engineering. And there were 3 Torvand students from Study Group 2, who had seen the translation data and could not deny what it showed, even though it went against everything their people believed. They met in secret, in the recycling bay where no one ever went. And Elias showed them the full scope of his work, and he showed them the grammatical structure, and the emotional lexicon, and the word for remember, and the live translation of the female Vrashkai who had looked into the camera and said, "We know you are watching." And every single one of them sat in stunned silence when they understood what it meant. Pelith the Dremni was the first to speak, and she said, "This changes everything." And Savory said, "It changes nothing if no one hears it." So they made a plan. The grand symposium was structured with 15-minute presentation slots, and there was a gap between the 3rd and 4th presentations of the afternoon session, where the stage would be empty for exactly 4 minutes, while the technical crew reset the display systems, and that 4-minute window was their chance. Pelith hacked the stage access systems so that Elias's identification chip would not trigger an alert, and the Kessari twins rigged the audio systems so that Elias could play Vrashkai recordings at full harmonic resolution, which required equipment the symposium stage did not normally have. And Savory uploaded Elias's complete translation algorithms to a secure server that could be accessed from the stage terminal. And the 3 Torvand students agreed to physically block the corridor that security would use to reach the stage if someone tried to stop him. It was reckless, and it was dangerous, and it could get all of them expelled, and it was the only option they had. The day of the symposium arrived, and the Great Hall of Veyrath Prime was packed with over 10,000 beings from across the galaxy. And the holographic broadcast systems were active, and billions more were watching from their homeworlds. And Scholar Drethan sat in the front row, looking satisfied and calm, because everything was going according to plan. The 3rd presentation ended, and the technical crew began their reset, and the stage was empty, and the lights were dim, and then a small figure walked out from behind the display screens and stepped up to the central podium. Elias Wren was 12 years old, and he weighed 91 pounds, and he was wearing wrinkled clothes, and he had dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were shaking, and he was the smallest person in a room of 10,000, and he was terrified. He looked out at the audience, and for one horrible second, his mind went completely blank, and all he could see was a sea of alien faces staring at him, and all he could feel was the weight of every insult, and every laugh, and every dismissal pressing down on his chest. Then he thought of his mother, and her hands moving through the air, shaping words from silence, and he thought, every language looks like noise to someone who has not learned to listen. And he pressed play. The first Vrashkai recording filled the great hall at full volume, and it was a deep, layered roar that shook the seats, and several audience members flinched, and someone near. The back made a sound of alarm, because it was raw and powerful and primal. Then Elias split the audio into its harmonic layers, and displayed each layer on the holographic screen above him as a separate color-coded waveform. And he pointed to the first layer and said, "This is the base frequency, and it carries spatial information about the speaker's location relative to the listener." And he pointed to the second layer and said, "This is the mid-harmonic, and it carries the emotional state of the speaker." And he pointed to the third layer and said, "This is the upper harmonic, and it carries the emotional state of the subject being discussed." And then he showed them how all three layers combined into a single grammatical structure that encoded not just information, but relationship and meaning and moral context. The hall was completely silent. He played recording after recording, and he showed translation after translation, and he walked them through the lexicon of over 2,000 mapped emotional relational constructs, and he explained how the Vrashkai grammar worked, and why it had resisted decoding for 400 years, and why it took a human brain to crack it. And then he did the thing that no one was prepared for. He switched to a live feed from Calum 7, and the holographic display showed a clearing in a dark forest where a group of Vrashkai had gathered, and in the center of the group was an enormous elder male with fur like silver smoke and eyes that burned like dying stars. The elder was speaking, and Elias translated in real time. The words appeared on the holographic display above the stage as Elias spoke them aloud, and the elder was telling a story, and it was a history, and it was about the cold lights that watch from the sky, and the ones who move beyond the air, and the hunger without respect that comes to take the ground that holds our dead. The Vrashkai knew about the space stations orbiting their world. And they knew about the sensor drones, and they knew about the aliens who had been watching them for centuries, and they knew about the mining operation that was coming to destroy their home. They had been talking about it for years. They had been talking about it in a language so complex and so alien that the galaxy's greatest minds had mistaken it for animal noise. The great hall was in chaos, and beings were standing and shouting, and some were crying. And the holographic broadcast carried every second of it to billions of viewers across the Concord. And Scholar Drethan was on his feet with his face twisted with fury, and he was shouting for security. But the 3 Torvan students were blocking the corridor, and Pellet had locked the stage systems so they could not cut the feed. And Savory had already uploaded the complete raw data and all of Elias's algorithms to the Open Concord Academic Network, where anyone could access them. Within minutes, xenolinguists on 12 different worlds had downloaded the data and begun running their own analyses, and within an hour, the first independent confirmations started coming in, and the results matched, and the grammar was real, and the translations were accurate. Elias stood on that stage with tears running down his face, and the entire galaxy watching, and he said, "They are not beasts, and they have never been beasts, and they have a language, and they have history, and they have memory, and they have been speaking to us for 400 years, and we did not listen, because we did not think they were worth listening to." In the back of the great hall, standing apart from everyone else, Kethis, the young Torvan, who had mocked Elias on his very first day at the academy, stood absolutely still, and he looked at the tiny human on the stage, and something shifted inside him that he would never be able to undo. And then the Concord communication systems received a signal from Calum 7 that was not a recording and was not a sensor feed, but was a direct, intentional transmission from the surface of the planet, routed through Elias's translation matrix. 72 hours after the Grand Symposium, the Galactic Concord chambers on Veyrath Prime were more crowded than they had been in a century, and every delegate from every member species was present, and the galleries were packed with journalists and scholars and diplomats and citizens who had traveled from across the galaxy to witness what was about to happen. The mining vote had been frozen, and the corporations were scrambling, and the political landscape of the entire Concord had shifted overnight, because a 12-year-old human boy had done what 400 years of galactic scholarship could not. Elias Wren stood in the center of the Concord chamber floor, and he was wearing clean clothes for the first time in weeks, because Savory had insisted on it, and he had combed his hair, and he looked like what he was, which was a very tired, very brave, very small child, standing in the middle of the most important room in the galaxy. Around him, in a vast circle, rose the tiered seats of the Concord delegates, and above them the observation galleries, and above those the holographic broadcast arrays that were sending this moment to every world in known space, and every single eye in that enormous room was fixed on him. But Elias was not looking at them. He was looking at the holographic display that dominated the far wall of the chamber, and on that display was a live feed from Calum 7. And standing in the red dust of a clearing, surrounded by black trees, was the largest living creature Elias had ever seen. Her name, as closely as his translation matrix could render it, was Vreth Kanshi, and she was the eldest matriarch of the largest Vrashkai pride on Calum 7. And she was the size of a ground transport vehicle, with 6 eyes that glowed like liquid gold, and fur that shifted between deep purple and midnight black with every breath, and claws that could tear through starship hull plating, and a voice that could shake mountains. She was terrifying. She was beautiful, and she was watching Elias through the camera, with an expression that his translation matrix told him was a complex emotional state that roughly meant cautious hope toward brave small thing. Elias had spent the last 3 days working with a team of engineers to build a translation rig that could convert his voice into an approximation of Vrashkai harmonic language, and it was strapped to his chest and throat, and it was uncomfortable and heavy, but it worked, at least partially. The problem was that human vocal cords could only produce a fraction of the frequencies that Vrashkai's speech required, and so his pronunciation would be terrible and incomplete, like a child trying to speak a language they had only read about in books. But the engineers had told him that the rig would fill in the gaps with synthesized harmonics, and Elias had told them that it might not matter anyway, because he had a theory about the Vrashkai that he had not shared with anyone. Yet, his theory was that the Vrashkai language had been designed to understand intent beneath imperfect sound, because the Vrashkai lived on a death world where storms and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions constantly distorted and disrupted their communications. And so their language had evolved to extract meaning from damaged and partial signals, and this meant that even if his pronunciation was broken and incomplete, the Vrashkai might still understand him, because they would hear what he meant, not just what he said. He hoped he was right, because everything depended on it. The chamber fell silent, and the Concord president, a tall, thin being from a species Elias did not recognize, nodded to him and said, "You may proceed." Elias took a deep breath and activated his translation rig and opened his mouth and spoke. The sound that came out was strange and layered, and it was not quite right, and he knew it was not quite right, because he could hear the synthetic harmonics filling in where his human voice fell short, and it sounded mechanical and stiff, and nothing like the flowing musical vocalizations of a real Vrashkai. But he spoke, and the words he tried to say in their language were, "I hear you, and I am small, and I am brief, but I am here." He waited. Vreth Kanshi stood motionless on the screen for a long moment, and the silence in the chamber was so complete that Elias could hear his own heartbeat. Then the great matriarch opened her mouth, and the sound that came out filled the entire Concord chamber through the speakers. And it was deep and vast and layered, and it resonated in Elias's chest and in his bones and in something deeper than bones. His translation matrix processed the harmonics in real time, and the words appeared on the display above him, and the entire chamber read them together. For 400 cycles we spoke to the sky, and the sky did not answer, and we sang our histories to the cold lights, and the cold lights did not care. And our elders said that the ones beyond the air had no ears, and no hearts, and could not hear, and could not feel. Vreth Kanshi paused, and her 6 golden eyes locked onto the camera, and onto Elias. Now a small thing with a brief life has heard us, and we do not understand how this small thing did what the great ones could not. But we understand why, and it is because this small thing listened, not with power, but with care. Elias was crying, and he did not try to hide it, and tears ran down his face and dripped off his chin, and he did not wipe them away. Vreth Kanshi continued, and her voice shifted to a deeper register that his matrix identified as the tone used for sacred declarations. We will remember this small thing long after its bones are dust, and our children's children's children will sing its name in the language of feeling that honors. And so long as our people breathe, the small voice who listened will not be forgotten. Chamber erupted, and delegates were on their feet, and some were cheering, and some were weeping, and some were arguing furiously, but the tide was overwhelming and undeniable, because the Vrashkai were not animals, and they had never been animals, and everyone could see it now, and everyone could hear it, and there was no going back. The vote was called, and it was unanimous. The Vrashkai were granted full sentient species status and protected sovereignty over Kalem 7, and the mining operation was permanently cancelled, and the corporations that had spent billions preparing for extraction lost everything in a single afternoon. Scholar Drethan was removed from his position at the Academy, effective immediately, and a formal investigation was opened into his suppression of Elias's research and his financial connections to the mining consortium. And within a week, he was facing charges before the Concord Academic Ethics Board. The 3 Torvan students who had blocked the corridor during the symposium were celebrated as heroes by their peers, even though the Academy administration tried to discipline them, and the charges were quietly dropped when the public outcry became too loud to ignore. Peleth the Dremni, who had hacked the stage systems, received 17 job offers from intelligence agencies across the Concord before the week was out. Savory was offered a position at the most prestigious research institute in Shelvari space, but she turned it down because she said she was not finished at the academy yet, and she had more work to do. And Elias became the most famous human being in the history of the galaxy overnight, and his face was on every newsfeed, and his name was spoken on every world. And humanity, which had been dismissed as a premature species barely worth noticing, was suddenly looked at with new eyes. Because if one human child could do this, then what else might humans be capable of? On the evening after the vote, Elias was walking through the corridors of the academy alone because he needed quiet and he needed space to think, and he turned a corner and found Kethis standing there. The young Torvan who had laughed at him on his first day and called him a little ape and told him to drop his research was standing in the corridor, and he looked different, and something in his eyes had changed, and he was not smiling, and he was not mocking. Kethis looked at Elias for a long time, and then he did something that Elias did not expect. He lowered all 4 of his arms to his sides, and he tilted his head back, and he exposed his throat. Elias did not know much about Torvan culture, but he knew enough to know what that gesture meant, because it was the deepest expression of respect in Torvan society, and it was a gesture that said, "I trust you with my life, and I acknowledge that you are greater than I understood." And it was the first time in recorded history that a Torvan had ever performed it toward a human. Kethis held the pose for 10 seconds, And then he lowered his head and looked at Elias and said, "I was wrong about you." And his voice was rough and quiet, and Elias said, "You were wrong about them." And Kethis nodded and said, "Yes, and I was wrong about them too." Then Kethis walked away, and Elias watched him go, and he thought that maybe changing one mind at a time was how you changed a galaxy. Later that night, Savory found Elias sitting on a bench near the observation deck, and she sat down next to him. And the stars turned slowly outside the window, and she said, "You know what you have done, and you know that the galaxy will never think about humanity the same way again." Elias shrugged and said, "Humans are not special, and we are small, and we are fragile, and we do not live very long, and we cannot read minds or change color or breathe underwater." And Savory said, "Then how did you do what no one else could do?" And Elias thought about it and said, "We come from a loud, messy, complicated world, and we learned how to find meaning in the noise. And that is all I did, and I just listened." Savory chimed softly, which was the Shelvari equivalent of a smile, and she said, "That is more than enough." They sat together in comfortable silence and watched the stars. 1 week later, Elias was back in his tiny closet room, and he had his headphones on, and he was not resting, and he was not celebrating, and he was listening. On his screen was a new set of recordings, and these were not from Kalen 7, and they were from a place called Meridian 12, which was an ocean world in a distant system. And deep in the trenches of that world, something vast and ancient had been producing complex sonic patterns for what scientists estimated was over 1,000,000 years. And nobody had ever tried to translate those patterns, because nobody believed there was anything to translate. But Elias was listening, and he was slowing the recordings down, and speeding them up, and separating the layers, and running them through his algorithms. And he was smiling, because the galaxy was full of voices that no one had ever heard, and Elias Wren was just getting started. And somewhere, in the deep black water of a world he had never seen, something ancient and patient stirred, and sang, and waited for the small voice who listened to find it. The galaxy had spent centuries conquering the silence between stars, and it had built engines that crossed the void, and weapons that shattered worlds, and stations that hung in the dark like jewels, and it had never occurred to any of them that the greatest frontier was not space. It was listening. And the smallest voice in the room had heard what no one else could.